today's guest is Karl Friston, one of the most influential neuroscientists alive and probably of all time. And we'll be talking about his free energy principle, which is a unified theory of the brain, but goes beyond that. It has been applied in physics, philosophy, biology, machine learning, psychology, you name it. And in the first half of this conversation, we'll be talking about his free energy principle in general. And then in the second half, we'll be talking about how it links to psychology, psychopathology, and psychotherapy. And especially the first half is pretty difficult to understand, at least if you haven't heard about these ideas yet. But I encourage you to try to get as much as possible out of it in order to understand the second half of the conversation, which might be more interesting for you if you are more interested in psychology. So yeah, I hope you have fun, and let's go. Okay, Karl Friston, welcome to the Painting Onions podcast. Thank you so much for taking your time.
My pleasure. Lovely to be here.
Thanks. Okay, so my first question is, how would you explain the free energy principle to a psychology student?
I would explain the free energy principle to a psychology student, I think, by appealing to ideas established probably by the students of Plato, but certainly expounded by Kant and Helmholtz, and in recent times, notions like analysis by synthesis, perception as hypothesis testing. So the basic idea is that we have to construct explanations for our sensory inputs, and those sensory inputs can be of various sorts. They can be exteroceptive, visual and auditory. They can be proprioceptive, making sense of the signals from our muscles, or indeed gut feelings, interoception. Whatever the modality, the brain, we have to make sense of all those signals and how they were caused, and the narratives and the states of affairs in the world out there beyond our skull-bound brains that are generating those signals. So the idea is that the brain is a literally fantastic organ. It generates, it's a purveyor of fantasies, hypotheses, models that best explain or account for those sensory data. So this view puts sense-making in the realm of an inside-out process, that you're generating predictions of what's going on and what would happen if your understanding of the world was correct. What would I sense? And then you take the sensations and then you can compare them, and then you can either adjust your beliefs, your representations of the world out there to make your predictions more like the sensations, or you can move in order to resample the world. For example, palpate it visually by looking over here or looking over there, in order to make your predictions about your proprioceptive, your muscle signals, conform to your predictions. So the idea can be simply reduced to minimizing the mismatch between what I think or anticipate I should be sensing, if my understanding, my sense of what's going on is correct, and what I actually register with my sensory organs, namely the prediction error. And I can do that in two ways. I can either change my mind, technically this is Bayesian belief updating, or I can just sample some new data in a way that renders or solicits those data that I predicted. So basically I use my reflexes, and these can be sort of motor reflexes that determine where I move with my muscles, or there can be autonomic reflexes that determine the sort of the physiological or homeostatic state of my body to make my predictions come true. So if you think of free energy as a mathematical information theoretic description of prediction error, then all that we are saying, or all the free energy principle says, is all of action and perception and any aspect that intervenes under the rubric of cognition is just in the service of reducing prediction errors, namely reducing free energy. So that, in a nutshell, is probably the best way of describing to a psychologist or a cognitive scientist what the underlying imperatives are for all of action and perception. It's just to keep your understanding of the generation of the signals that you're encountering apt in the sense of minimizing prediction error.
Mm-hmm. Why is it useful to boil down what the brain is doing to really just one principle? Is it just because that's the way it is, or is it useful for, I don't know, research, understanding the nature of the brain or humans in general?
That's a very good question. It is certainly, but you're absolutely right that the agenda here is to find the simplest account principle that would explain the nature of our sense making and our sentient behavior, the choices we make and the way that we move, the way that we navigate through the world, both at a very elemental in the moment level, but also at a personal level, a pro-social level, in terms of life choices and the like. The idea that underwrites the free energy principle is that there should be a first principle account of all of this behavior that is just minimizing free energy or minimizing prediction error. Why is that useful? So there are a number of answers there. It's useful because if you know the basic principles, the imperatives that undergird neuronal dynamics, belief updating in the brain, sense making in the brain, and the attendant motor control, the things that we decide, the choices we make, and the way that we enact those choices, then you can realize these processes in silico in computers. Why might that be useful? Well, first of all, it allows you to establish a proof of principle that this is how we work. And if you want to understand the brain when it's not working so properly, then it's very useful to be able to understand how it works when it's working optimally or normatively. More practically, and in empirical research, once you've got an idealized little brain in a computer that is responding in the normative and the optimal way under this first principle account, you can then use that as an observation model or a statistical model of empirical behavior, the responses that people actually may make to various cues or various challenges or sensory perturbations or economic games, experimental paradigms, psychophysics paradigms. So if you can now make the model explain one particular person's choices by adjusting the parameters of that model, and in particular the prior beliefs that are implicit in that model of somebody's behavior or choices, then that enables you to ask some quite deep questions about what distinguishes you from me in terms of what prior beliefs might you have to hold in order to explain your behavior that are distinct from my prior beliefs. That is interesting from a number of perspectives, but becomes particularly prescient in the context of computational psychiatry. So say I had schizophrenia or autism or had a predilection or was addictive in my behavior, then I can now try to understand what kinds of beliefs and the processes of belief updating at a neuronal level, at a physiological level, at the level of, say, neurochemistry and psychopharmacology, that would lead me to behave like that as opposed to behave like somebody else. So this was the, if you like, the original motivation for developing the free energy principle. It was really a way of formalizing in a crisp and clear way what an ideal Bayesian brain would do. And then as soon as you write that down, you realize there is no ideal Bayesian brain. It's always a question of what particular priors characterize this person's brain that render their behavior Bayes optimal. Technically, that's a reflection of something called the complete class theorem. And that is useful in itself because it means I can now phenotype, understand, quantify, characterize any given person under the assumption that they are performing under the free energy principle, but with a personalized, specific set of prior beliefs. And when I talk about beliefs, I should qualify this. These are not sort of propositional beliefs that you and I can discuss and argue about. These are just conditional probability distributions that are encoded physically by my synaptic activity, my neuronal activity, my connections, and even beyond that in terms of the embodied brain, the physical structure of my brain and the attributes of my sense organs. All of these things represent at some level prior beliefs, some endowed by evolution, some learned during neurodevelopment, and some updated on the fly as I try to make sense of my sensory data. So this sort of Bayesian belief updating provides a formal account of neuronal activity that we can measure with brain imaging or electroencephalography. It provides a formal account of how we move. It provides a formal account of the decisions and choices we make. All of these things can be measured empirically and then used to reverse engineer the kinds of beliefs and models of our world that would best explain the data that we've experimentally solicited from subjects or different cohorts.
I'm probably guilty of understanding some of your, or maybe especially when I first heard about it, the beliefs and predictions to like conscious beliefs, conscious predictions. And I will have some questions about psychology and psychopathology, and then we will see how far off it is to translate this like that. But could you maybe again speak about the Bayesian brain and use, and you've mentioned it again, but I found it really useful to understand it when you talk about prior beliefs and then the sensory input and then the combination of those to create the perception. Could you?
Sure,
yeah.
Absolutely. So the free energy principle, in a sense, is a generalization of the Bayesian brain hypothesis. So what is the Bayesian brain hypothesis? I mean, there are many ways of reading that hypothesis. Originally, it was the notion that many aspects of our behavior and also our perception in terms of multi-sensory perception in different modalities, how we integrate different sources of information in an optimal way, and indeed in a Bayes optimal way, provided a mathematical account of optimal behavior. So you often come across the phrase ideal Bayesian observer, and what that basically means is that the best sense is made of any sensory data in order to disclose and represent the underlying causes of that data. So this notion also applies to action in the sense that much of motor control theory in terms of the way that we move also seems to be aptly described under an ideal Bayesian account. So the Bayesian account says quite simply that you are in a position of trying to infer the causes of your sensations. And to do that, you use something called a generative model. And this is, again, it's quite simply a probabilistic specification of the relationship between causes and consequences. And the causes are out there in the world. They are latent causes in the sense that they are hidden from direct observation. I can only sample that world with my sense organs. So that's all that the brain has available in terms of making sense of the causes of its sensations. And it uses the generative model in the following way: that it starts off with a prior belief that the hidden states of affairs in the world are like this. And then it goes and gets the data and then assimilates the evidence for particular hypotheses with the prior beliefs to produce an updated belief, an updated representation after you have seen the data. So it's a posteriori or posterior to seeing the data. So that process of having a belief, and if I just sort of describe that belief as a distribution of the way things could be, I've got a prior belief, I see some data, and I literally move that belief in order to make it into a posterior belief that now is informed by the evidence or the likelihood of those data under this belief or under that belief. And that process of moving my beliefs that you can imagine being encoded by neuronal activity, for example, that now I have a different pattern of neuronal responses in my brain, and that encodes a probabilistic belief, a Bayesian belief that has just moved from here, a priori, the prior, to the posterior, given the evidence. So that's an expression of or a realization of Bayes' rule. It's this basically updating a prior belief into a posterior belief through a process of Bayesian belief updating that depends upon how you think those data were generated. So this notion of Bayesian belief updating, it's literally changing your mind. But again, at most levels, this is subpersonal. It's not declarative. It could be, and it's a really interesting question, which I'm sure we will come back to later on. At what point do these beliefs become personal, become declarative, propositional? But the kind of Bayesian belief updating that we generally deal with is much at the level of reflexes and so moment to moment assimilation of auditory and visual and proprioceptive data over several hundred milliseconds to a few seconds that is not really amenable to conscious access. So that's the Bayesian brain hypothesis. I said before that free energy principle sort of generalizes that, and it does so in a couple of directions. First, it says, well, exactly the same principles that would underwrite belief updating in terms of changing your mind so that you now have a better understanding or representation of the causes of your sensations, and also apply to the way that we move. And the idea here is that the minimization of that prediction error is this one way of doing Bayesian belief updating. So technically, if I was talking to an engineer as opposed to a psychologist, the engineer would understand this as Bayesian filtering. In engineering, this would be like Kalman filtering. It's data assimilation in a Bayes optimal way. But exactly the same maths and the same calculus can be used to understand the way we move. And to put that simply, in a sort of way that a physiologist would I think understand it. The idea here is that if I want to move my hand from here to here, then I have this prior belief that I will sense my hand being in this particular position. And if a priori, I think that is the likely state of affairs in the immediate future, then I will have predictions about the proprioception, the stretch receptor firing, providing afferents or information from my muscles and my motor plant. And that produces a prediction error when my hand is over here, because I actually predict it to be over here. So now I've now got a prediction error, but I can resolve that prediction error simply by taking the prediction errors and sending them back to the muscles to cause a contraction until the signals that they're sending are consistent with my top-down predictions of what I expect to feel or where I expect my arm to be. And that's just a description of a classical motor reflex. Can be unpacked in all sorts of ways from the point of view of physiology. This would be a statement of the equilibrium point hypothesis of Feldman, popular in the 1980s in motor control literature. It could be a statement of something called perceptual control theory, again popular in this, in the middle of the 20th century, the notion that in order to act and navigate a world, I just simply have to control the world to supply the right kind of sensory signals that are in the range of what I predicted. So the classic example here is catching a ball while running. All I have to do is to minimize the distance between the ball and my hands. In order to do that, I don't have to sort of work out trajectories and do all sorts of complicated kinematics and sort of trajectory calculations. All I need to do is just to keep the ball and my hand in a certain relationship. The idea goes even further back, and depending on whether you're German or American, attributed to various people. If you're American, it'd be William James's notion of ideomotor, the ideomotor theory, that was popular in the Victorian ages as an explanation for people who would induce various states where you could get them to lift their hand just by suggestion. And the idea is exactly the same, that if you believe this is what's happening to your body, then the reflexes will fulfill those beliefs until that belief becomes true. So there's a long history behind this generalization of the Bayesian brain hypothesis beyond perception into the enactive domain, which is a move which is sympathetic to paradigm shifts, at the beginning of this century, the sort of situated, enactive, extended, and all those good E's. The other move is to in addition to making the Bayesian brain accountable to this enactivist situated perspective, embodied perspective on what we're doing. The free energy principle brings a formalism to the table that has a process theory attached with it. So what I'm saying here is that you can use the Bayesian brain hypothesis to tell lots of just so stories. It looks as if we are Bayes optimal. An adequate description of our behavior is as ideal Bayesian observers under some assumptions. The applications of the free energy principle go beyond that. They say, well, that's fine, but you can also posit specific neuronal processes and articulate those in a neurally plausible way to provide an account of the actual neuronal processes and physiological processes, and possibly immunological processes, neurohormonal processes that are responsible for this kind of Bayesian belief updating. And when you commit to a process theory, that's important, because then you can actually start to predict how a brain or a body would respond if your understanding of that belief updating was correct. So if the Bayesian brain hypothesis was correct and the belief updating was implemented using these neuronal and embodied processes, then we would expect to see these kinds of choices and these kinds of electrophysiological responses that we can measure empirically. That's important when it comes to understanding, again, bringing us back to computational psychiatry. That's important when you now start to drill down on the key neuronal and other processes that underwrite, that mediate this kind of belief updating, because it enables you to understand what would happen if this mechanism was broken or this neuronal process was broken. And in particular, the special role of certain neurotransmitters that set the sensitivity or the gain of synapses, for example, and how might you understand the action of psychedelics or psycholytics or antipsychotic drugs on sense making from the point of view of a psychopharmacologist or a neuropharmacologist. So it connects the Bayesian brain hypothesis to very specific process theories that we can actually empirically watch unfold in this person or that person, and start to understand mechanistically exactly what role, what computational role this mechanism, this synaptic mechanism or pharmacological mechanism, or this brain lesion or this disconnection is playing in generating the usually aberrant behavior or aberrant belief updating. So, for example, hallucinations and delusions would be sort of the poster child of false inference. So, just to qualify the use of the phrase false inference, the Bayesian brain hypothesis is clearly a hypothesis that you can cast everything as inference, whether it's inferring, sense making, whether it's control or planning as inference, as would be required to understand action and choice behavior. It's all about inferring. And if it's all about inferring, how does it go wrong? Well, it doesn't matter how it goes wrong. You know immediately that there must be an explanation in terms of false inference. So, literally type 1 and type 2 errors.
Like I said, I will ask some questions about psychology, and then I actually wanted to ask you about false inference when we go to psychopathology. So I will bring those questions up in a moment. I wanted to comment on something you said, that it's important to have this mechanistic explanation for what the brain is doing in order to, and I think you sometimes quote Richard Feynman for saying, in order to understand something, you have to be able to build it. So this is mechanistic way. And actually, you said something with suggestive things, or like hypnosis, that people can actually, by hypnosis, make you do things that you didn't really want to do. And I actually have the book. I don't know if you know it. Surely you're joking, Mr. Feynman. It's the autobiography of Richard Feynman, and there's a passage that I wanted to read out, and I think you can explain what happens with the free energy principle, but let's see what you say. So he's in front of an audience, which is the Princeton Graduate College, and there was this hypnotist, and he's hypnotizing Feynman and I think others. And then so Feynman writes here in this autobiography, the hypnotist made various demonstrations, having me do things that I couldn't normally do. And at the end, he said that after I came out of hypnosis, instead of returning to my seat directly, which was the natural way to go, I would walk all the way around the room to go to my seat from the back. All through the demonstration, I was vaguely aware of what was going on and cooperating with the things the hypnotist said. But this time I decided, damn it, enough is enough. I'm going to go straight to my seat. When it was time to get up and go off the stage, I started to walk straight to my seat. But then an annoying feeling came over me. I felt so uncomfortable that I couldn't continue. I walked all the way around the hall. So isn't this something that you just explained by, or let's put it like this. I heard about the motor command, not prediction, the other way around, motor prediction, not command. And this idea that, as you said, there's this prediction error of, or the prior belief that you move your hand and then by moving it, you fulfill the prediction. Isn't this speaking to it as well?
No, absolutely. I haven't heard that. It's a brilliant example. A very sophisticated in the sense that, it's not just about hypnosis where your hand is feeling lighter and lighter and lighter, that you can actually install prior beliefs about the route that you take when walking around the room. That's quite remarkable to actually have that level, that narrative in your generative model that is so amenable that I presume in people who are susceptible to suggestion, but to actually be able to install in somebody else that prior belief that is subsequently enacted. And it's interesting, he used the words uncomfortable when violating those prior beliefs. You certainly see that in psychiatry, that and indeed in just psychology generally, the violation of a prior belief, and when something becomes on average surprising and uncertain, that is almost inevitably accompanied by a feeling of angst and anxiety and discomfort, which, of course, from the point of view of the free energy principle, is perfectly sensible. That if it's my job to suppress and resolve all prediction errors, to in the moment resolve surprise, then a failure or the notion that that surprise is irreducible is going to be counter to the basic imperatives that underwrite the way that we do sort of navigate our world. So it's nice to use the word uncomfortable there. But Feynman, I mean, from the maths point of view, he's underneath all of this. As you say, this sort of what was purported to be on his blackboard at the moment of his death. If I can't create something, I can't understand it. That is so true. And when I was answering your question before, I mean, why would you need a theory like this? And I said, well, basically, it allows you to go away and simulate and build a little brain in a computer. Just being able to actually create something that approximates you and me in a very elemental way really does endow a mechanistic understanding, which itself generates all sorts of insights when you have to contend with the actual process theories that may be mediating this.
Okay, so another question that I have is when the job of the brain is like minimizing prediction error. One question that I have is this: you said this the two distributions and then the divergence which we want to minimize. Is this the free energy? Or and if it's the case, what about the precision of those distributions? Don't we also want to minimize them? Or you know what I mean? If you say like minimizing free energy, is it minimizing the prediction error? That is minimizing the divergence between the two distributions, and or is it also minimizing the precision? And what is precision anyway? I think you haven't talked about precision in itself yet. So sorry for the audience, but yeah.
Yes, no, you've talked about precision. I haven't, right? So,
yeah, sorry. I was probably expecting that you would have come up with precision by this question, but yeah.
Right. Well, it's great you've done that, because I repeat that that's probably from the point of view of psychology and understanding ourselves one of these key mechanisms. So, in brief, you're absolutely right. That the idea is to change your mind, do your Bayesian belief updating until you get the best posterior belief that is accountable to the data at hand. So what people generally have in mind to understand this sort of graphically or mathematically is that there's a prior belief that lives over here that can be quite broad or it can be quite precise. So the precision you're talking about is mathematically just the inverse of the dispersion or the width or the confidence that you would ascribe to a particular belief. So if it has very high precision, then you think that this quantity, this variable, this state is within very narrow bounds. If it has very low precision or very high variance, and you don't have much confidence in the precision of that belief, then it could be anything. You have a very broad, dispersed distribution. So when it comes to belief updating, if you remember, there are three probability distributions. There are three kinds of, if you like, beliefs in play, and they are combined according to Bayes' rules. So you have your prior, and then you'll have your likelihood distribution, and then there will be some compromise, which is the posterior. So imagine, just for simplicity, we've got a prior belief and yet some evidence. This is the likelihood. This is what the sensory data brings to the table, is over here. And then what the posterior will do is to find the best compromise that is consistent with your prior beliefs, but also provides an accurate account of the evidence at hand that, that moves your prior beliefs towards the likelihood, as it were. And it is that movement that is indeed minimizing a distance. In fact, interestingly, it is the distance, the free energy discores I use the word distance and I shouldn't, it's divergence. Technically, there's a slight difference. So it minimizes divergence between the belief that your neural activity or your brain or your connection strengths are encoding, and the actual true posterior, the ideal Bayesian posterior, which is very difficult to compute, which is what Richard Feynman brought to the table. Mathematically, it exists, but it cannot be the true posterior, the best balance between the prior beliefs and the evidence at hand in the likelihood. It exists mathematically, but can't be physically realized in real world situations because it's just too complicated. So what Feynman did was to introduce something that's always bigger than the divergence that you want to actually minimize, and thereby by minimizing this thing that's always bigger, called a bound, then you're almost guaranteed to minimize the thing that you actually want to, or to identify the thing that you actually want to optimize, which is the posterior belief. So that's where the free energy comes from. It's it's just a way of rendering an intractable problem of exact Bayesian inference tractable and amenable to mediation or implementation by a physical process such as the brain, by converting it into an optimization problem, so that you can now just minimize something, prediction error, surprise, free energy, whatever you want. So to come back to your precision thing, let's say that we had a very precise prior belief, and there's some really noisy data. I'm looking at the world with the lights off, for example, and I can just see shadows. So in that situation, you've got precise prior beliefs, and the sensory precision is very, very low. And what that means is that you're going to move to your posterior a much lesser distance than the contrary situation where you have very, very precise sensory data, or a likelihood that had a great precision that's going to attract your posterior beliefs much more vigorously. So the relative precision of your prior beliefs relative to the sensory precision has an enormous influence on the degree of belief updating. So you tend to literally ignore imprecise data, for example, noisy data, whereas you are going to be compelled to change your mind much more, should you be an ideal Bayesian observer, if you're given or supplied some very precise likelihood data. Now, here's the twist. Estimating the precision doesn't come for free. That's something else you have to predict. So in order to get the right degree of belief updating, not only do you have to predict what you're going to sense, you also have to predict the predictability or the precision. So if you read precision as a predictability, then the brain is in the true game of inference, of trying to not only predict the quantitative difference, the content of an explanation for these sensory data, but also predict the predictability or the precision in order to get that balance right. And that precision, there's that, if you like, subjective precision, but again, it's subpersonal, becomes absolutely crucial in inference. So, if any of your viewers, or indeed yourself, have ever done something like a t-test to try and get a p-value, for example, to write a paper and saying, I found a significant effect of this drug, or in terms of a treatment response, you've done an inference. You've gone through the process, in fact, using mathematically exactly Feynman's free energy. You've made some simplifying assumptions about the relationship between the two key quantities you need to estimate. First of all, it's the difference in the group means. This group responded to this drug with this average response, and this group with a placebo, say, had this average response. So the first thing you need to estimate is the difference in the group means. That's usually quite simple. Now, here's the key thing. You also have to estimate the precision. And remember, the precision is the inverse variance or the standard error. So you use the sum of squared residuals about the means in order to estimate the precision. And then you multiply the precision by, say, a prediction error under the null hypothesis. There's no difference in group means. So you now have a precision-weighted prediction error, which, because precision is 1 over the variance or the standard error, you've now got a group mean divided by a standard error. That just is a t-statistic. So the use of classical statistics to make inferences in our everyday jobs as scientists or data analysts contends with and resolves exactly the same problem the brain has to contend with, which is how to estimate not just what's going on and have hypotheses about, well, the world is in this state, but also the precision of those predictions and the precision of the sensory data. So if you come back to the t-statistic, if I put an evil little demon into your computer that always multiplied your standard error by 8, and you try to write scientific papers on the basis of a t-value that was always 8 times smaller than it should be, you're going to reach very different conclusions. I'm going to be a very different kind of scientist than if I did not disrupt your scientific inquiry with that little demon. And the little demons, of course, in the head are those failures of or aberrances of the physical encoding of that precision, and that just boils down to, under certain belief updating schemes, say for example predictive coding, it just boils down to the excitability of neurons that are encoding the free energy or the prediction error. So if I'm sitting here as a neuron and I'm broadcasting my prediction errors that I'm going to use in order to change my mind and do my belief updating, say, deeper in a cortical hierarchy, if I now become very, very excitable, then I'm going to have more influence on the changes in the beliefs, the updating higher in the hierarchy. And that corresponds basically to the increase in the precision of the likelihood. So it now attracts your posteriors with much greater vigor. So if you get the control of the excitability, the neuromodulation wrong, then you can see immediately how you've got a mechanistic understanding for false inference. And then you have a nice interpretation of the mode of action of nearly all drugs that are used in neurology and psychiatry. Nearly all the drugs target the kinds of neurotransmitters that set that excitability or neuromodulatory gain. So from the point of view of the physiology, there's a direct now understanding of the consequences of adjusting the gain or the neuromodulatory status of various populations from the point of view of the fantastic organ, the Bayesian brain, trying to assimilate the data and weight it accordingly via this process of precision weighting. If you're a psychologist, what would this look like? Well, what it would look like is that in predicting the predictability or predicting the precision, you are now affording a greater weight or a greater precision to this kind of sensory information as opposed to that kind of sensory information, or you're changing the balance between your prior beliefs and your likelihood. So that is therefore enabling you to potentially ignore stuff or attend to it. So now you've got a mathematical image of attention through a selective increase in the precision of certain, say, sensory prediction error populations. You've also got a mathematical model of attenuation, sensory attenuation, which, if we come back to it, relates directly to ideomotor theory and the hypnosis effects, in the sense that, if you recall previously, we were talking about the free energy principle / ideomotor account of movement as simply the prediction errors being used to drive the muscles. That means you've got to switch off, you've got to attenuate those predictions getting into the brain. Because if you had the prediction errors when my arm was over here and when a priori I intended it to be over here, if you weren't able to attend the ascending prediction errors, those would cause belief updating, and they would change my mind, and my beliefs then, some personal beliefs would be, oh, my hand is over here and it's staying over here. So you would subvert the movement. If you can't attenuate the precision, if you can't neuromodulate those prediction errors, and perhaps the best clinical example of that is Parkinson's disease, where you've lost, in virtue of a disruption to dopaminergic neurotransmission, you've lost the ability to nuance the precision and, in this instance, attenuate proprioceptive motor control like prediction errors. So that as soon as you form a belief, I'm going to initiate a movement, all your prediction errors just flood through because you cannot ignore them, and you change your mind. Oh, I'm not moving. So you can never actually initiate a movement. So this capacity to ignore, what I'm trying to do is to say that attention is wonderful and lovely, but the other side of the coin is equally important. Our ability to ignore is really important in sense making. And when it goes wrong, you really know about it because you can't basically move. I mean, perhaps just to demystify this, I use saccadic suppression as probably the best illustration of the importance of getting the precision right in a moment-to-moment, on a moment-to-moment basis. So, if I asked you just to track with your eyes my finger, and I place my finger very quickly over here, and then your eyes jump across in order to refixate my fingertip over here. In jumping across, you've had to sweep your eyeballs around. That induces retinal slip in your eyes. That would, if you were not able to attenuate it during the movement, register as optic flow. You would see the world whizzing around, and yet you don't see that. You can see that if you just know, this is the famous Helmholtz experiment, if you just push your eye by how gently compress your eye, you can see the world shifting around. It's exactly the same sensory input, but when you're moving, you know you're moving, and then you can switch off the precision, you can do your sensory attenuation, and thereby evince saccadic suppression, so that you know that this optical flow you've induced, there's no useful information there. It's, it has a low precision, and you can attenuate it and allow the movement to unfold. So sensory attenuation is really important, not just as a way of understanding failures of attenuation, but just in the way that we palpate our world, even down to the level of eye movements that unfold over, say, 250 milliseconds. So precision is really important.
Yeah. Okay, so as I told you, I'm a psychologist and I will become a psychotherapist. So in the end, I'm really interested in like this conscious experience with my thoughts and feelings and behavior and motivation and stuff like that. And you said already that your or the beliefs and the predictions in the free energy principle is not definitely not one-to-one translatable to my beliefs about the world, about myself, about what will happen if I did that, and my emotions. So, but can you say that at least something is true in this translation? Because I recall, for example, one paper from Ryan Smith and I think it's called active inference, or the free energy principle does not contradict folk psychology, FOLK. Can't pronounce it, but yeah, could you comment on that?
Yes, well, Ryan does some beautiful work. I'm not familiar with that particular one because he writes so many papers, and very long papers, I should say, as
Okay.
well.
Yeah.
I know that one, but I have to go through them. They are well worth the read if you can commit enough time to read them. Yeah, no, that's a really important question. And, you know, I think to unpack that and to situate propositional beliefs that underwrite selfhood and emotions and feelings and the like, we're going to have to talk about the nature, the structure of the generative models that the brain brings to the table, that I bring to the table to sense make. And one key aspect of these generative models that is actually installed by evolution, but also by neurodevelopment, by the very structure of the eco-niches and the environments that we have to explain, is the hierarchical structure. So it is generally understood that the sort of generative model used by the brain is a hierarchical generative model. And I repeat, a generative model is just a way of generating consequences from causes that you use to generate the predictions. So if you want to think about belief updating through the lens of predictive coding, for example, where you've got these sort of prediction errors generated at the sensory periphery, say, of some centrifugal or centripetal hierarchical generative model, you've got sensations impinging on the outer layers of this hierarchy. They're generating prediction errors. They're passed to the next layer in, very much like an onion, and they cause belief updating to produce better predictions that are passed down. So you've got this sort of notion, which you actually have in the neuroanatomy and the neurophysiology, of a counter stream of inside out or ascending prediction errors, and inside out descending predictions. And the predictions are always trying to eliminate the prediction errors, and the prediction errors are always trying to update the predictions. And this happens recursively as you get deeper and deeper and deeper into this centripetal hierarchy. Another key thing that happens is that time slows down as you get deeper in the hierarchy. So in the same way that if we understand our visual hierarchy as representing increasingly abstract explanations for a visual scene that encompass more and more of space. So right at the periphery, at the sensory surface of this sort of imaginary spherical or centripetal generative model, then representations only see a very, very small part of the world. Say, classical receptive field the size of my thumb, held out at arm's length. But by the time you get to, say, the third or fourth order visual levels, where you may have the representations of forms that may underwrite a perception of a face, you've now expanded the scope of your inference in space in this instance, but also in time, which basically means, this is what I had in mind when thinking about Feynman's courteous excursion to make the hypnotist's prophecies come true. As you get deeper into the hierarchy, each level of the hierarchy reciprocally exchanging messages, statistics, in order to make the best sense of what is represented at the level below. Things slow down in the sense that your beliefs now encompass greater periods of time. So in the auditory system, you might be at the lowest levels encoding frequency glides and phonemes. At a higher level, you might have sort of lexical representations. At a higher level, you might have the meanings and semantics. You might then have syntax, and then sentences, and then narratives, and then whole life stories. As you get deeper and deeper up, then the deeper abstractions now provide a top-down prediction of the context that constrains your belief updating at the lower level, which basically begs the question, what kinds of beliefs would be very, very deep in the brain, very high in the hierarchy? And probably one of the most important kinds of beliefs are those that underwrite selfhood. The hypothesis that I am a thing, which you don't need, but it is certainly conceivable that one part of your generative model, one part of the fantasy that you bring to the table to explain all of this coordinated message passing that has to be coordinated because of this precision weighting we were talking about. One simple explanation is that I am a being, that I am a me, I am an agent, and that and this is my hypothesis that best explains, and I can recognize the patterns of input that are afforded or delivered to this very high level representation. I can explain them simply by the hypothesis that I am a being. And furthermore, I am a being in this particular state. I'm a happy being, I'm an anxious being, I'm a depressed being, I'm in this kind of mood, I'm embarrassed. All of these attributes of self can now not only be recognized, but also can now be used to generate predictions about the precision, and just ignore this kind of evidence or attend to this kind of evidence because I'm in this kind of state. A simple example would be flight or fright. That if I recognize certain patterns of bodily sensations in conjunction with certain pro-social or visual cues that are of a threatening kind, and that means, well, the best explanation for this pattern of input in a sort of James Langian sense that combines the interoception with the exteroception and possibly proprioception is I am in a state of anxiety, in a state of fear, for example. I've got a racing heart. I've just seen something red flash across the periphery of my vision. Then this means I am most likely to be in a state of anxiety. And if I'm in a state of anxiety, that has certain implications for the deployment of my predictions of precision and predictability. And generally what will happen is that you will sort of start to attend to the sensorium in order to respond to the situation of angst, where we said before that angst means uncertainty about what's going to happen. So this is a situation where you'd really want to attend to sensory evidence from the world to see what's going on and to possibly remove yourself or freeze in this particular situation. But all of that mechanics rests upon a really sophisticated aspect of these hierarchical generative models, which is essentially a representation of self. You don't need that. I mean, a virus doesn't need that. One could imagine that many insects don't need that. You could even argue that a bird doesn't really need this sense of selfhood. You can work quite happily as a Bayesian brain, a Bayesian homeostat or allostat, quite functionally, and get through life without ever needing this explanation, oh, it's me doing this. And furthermore, it's me in this kind of belief state that I can recognize. So Ryan has this wonderful notion that certain people, there's a difference in the way that we a priori try to recognize different emotional states, for example, and one prior that discriminates between one person and another person, maybe the degree of coarse graining of these different emotional states of being, feeling states of being. And leading to this notion of a sort of an emotional alexithymia, dyslexia of emotions. That you do, so some people, I'm feeling good or bad, and that's it. and could be quite a base optimal. That could be base optimal for them. And there are other people who have very fine gradations and a high dimensional representation in some emotional space, which means that they're much more sensitive and they can't articulate and recognize different states of being and have a much more nuanced response to it. But at the end of the day, all of the, irrespective of the coarse graining or fine graining of selfhood, just having a self model is quite remarkable. And there are some interesting arguments to be had as to in what circumstances would you ever need a self model, and how does that relate to agency? And that tells you something quite structurally profound about the nature of the generative models that you and I are equipped with, relative, say, to a bird and certainly to an insect.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but when you, for example, say that this James Lang theory or James or Lang theory, you said, okay, well, I'm inferring that I'm afraid, for example. So, and in a way, this also sounds like Lisa Feldman Barrett with the how emotions are made, or theory of constructed emotions. But isn't this, or could it also be conscious beliefs? Because, okay, in a way, anxiety is then produced automatically, and the brain or the embodied brain is inferring, oh, I'm anxious, and then feeling anxious. But couldn't it also be like conscious beliefs that are doing that?
Yep, that was a brilliant question. Yeah, no, so being aware of these states of selfhood, as you exactly rightly point out, is fundamentally different from simply representing them at a subpersonal level and deploying the right attention and the right sort of autonomic reflexes that would be appropriate for a system that's recognized that it's in this particular flight or fright mode, or it's relaxed and happy, or it's in an epistemic foraging mode. That's absolutely right. So the way that normally this is resolved in my world is, as soon as something like that is observed, that there's another level of awareness, what that immediately tells you is that is a hypothesis that has to be part of a generative model. So your question, I would read as you telling me, is it not the case that beyond just being able to recognize certain states of being that have an emotional valence, I also have representations that I have recognized these, that I am now aware of this. Mm-hmm. You can take that argument even to the point of qualia, qualitative experiences, that you actually have somewhere deep in your generative model this explanation for exchanges and understanding of the way that the world is composed and all its continuities, including conversations with philosophers, that there is a hypothesis of qualia. Mm-hmm. Now, people who are not philosophically fluent wouldn't necessarily have that. You might imagine there are, a cat wouldn't necessarily worry about its qualia, whether the other cat is seeing red, the same red that this cat is worrying about. It's perfectly possible to be a functional ideal Bayesian observer without having these things. But certainly it looks as though certain human beings, certainly philosophers at least, have now equipped themselves with this other notion that not only are there particular states of being that can be attributed to a minimal selfhood, but now there are certain attributes that mean that I can recognize that I am in that belief state. Above that, there are now representations, I am now seeing red. And then I can think about the alternative hypotheses. What happens if I'm not seeing red? What happens if or more precisely, what happens if the red I'm seeing is not your red? So the story I'm trying to tell here is that sometimes these questions about propositional beliefs and beliefs that that take us beyond a minimal selfhood into self-awareness and the like, the questions themselves actually speak to various components of generative models, which are possibly more interesting than the answers to the questions. And you see this in philosophy in terms of a move from the hard problem to the meta-hard problem or the meta problem, which Andy Clark nicely summarizes as the real problem in philosophy is, why do philosophers spend so much time puzzling about why they have qualia? And of course, the answer to that question, well, perhaps that doesn't have an answer, but what you can say is, well, the very fact that you get human beings who can ask, what is it like to have a qualia? And is a qualia the same kind of qualia from one human being to another? The very fact you can ask that question tells you immediately you've got the kind of generative model that can entertain counterfactuals. So that's quite important, because, and it comes back to this notion of agency we were talking about before. So the kind of generative models, so the whole of the free energy principle could actually apply quite happily to a virus or a thermostat. So what's the difference between the generative models that would underwrite the behavior of a thermostat and the generative models that clearly you and I employ when exchanging with our world? And the key thing is that we plan and the thermostat doesn't. So what does it mean to plan? Well, it simply means I've got a generative model of the consequences of my action. What does that mean? Well, it means something quite remarkable. I have a generative model of the future. So now I've got a generative model, which a thermostat or any other feedback mechanism, and possibly most insects, for example, they don't have. They don't need it. They don't need to plan. They don't need to think about the future. And crucially, what would happen if I did that? But as soon as you have a generative model of the consequences of action, where those consequences are in the future, now that becomes a hidden state, because it's hidden in the future, and it can have potentially many different values. So you automatically, you equip your generative models with the temporal depth, but also with the capacity to have a counterfactual richness. And I'm using phrase here from my friend Anil Seth, which which he thinks is a fundamental requisite for minimal selfhood. It's just the ability to entertain hypotheses in your generative model that might be true or might not be true, and to have a counterfactual richness or breadth to the things that you can the consequences of your action. And that counterfactual aspect becomes absolutely crucial, because in order to engage in the kinds of thought experiments that you'll find in philosophy, for example, what would it be like if I behaved and acted in exactly the same way that I behave and act, but had no sense of self, if I was a zombie? What would it be like if I saw red, but my red was your green? So these are sort of, classical thought experiments that, to my mind, from a very simplistic point of view and a trained point of view, keep philosophical debate alive. But the more telling thing is, what sort of creature could possibly imagine being a zombie? Yeah, what are these impossible counterfactuals that could possibly be entertained by a generative model? Well, then you now start to have an answer. Well, we have to have this capacity for counterfactual thinking in order to plan the future, because we have to select amongst a number of different moves or acts or policies, sequences of actions. And in the act of selection, you have to have something to select from, which means you have to have outcomes that are more or less plausible under your prior beliefs and and the pressure to resolve average surprise or uncertainty by taking this course of action versus that course of action. And the very capacity for this counterfactual thinking now tells you, well, it's certainly now plausible that agents that plan could certainly now entertain thought experiments that lead to questions about, well, what would it be like to be a zombie? Or what would it be like to have a different kind of qualitative experience, or to have no qualitative experience? The very fact that philosophers ask these questions tells you an enormous amount about their generative models.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So in a way, since it is counterfactual, you can really ask anything or imagine anything. I learned about the free energy principle like maybe 2 years ago, and again I was confronted with psychological concepts or constructs which reminded me of it. And I have this list of some of those, and maybe you can just comment on if it makes sense in your view to connect it to the free energy principle, or if it's something else. Or so one is the confirmation bias, that is being biased that you're in a way that you're gathering evidence that's in favor of your belief, for example, disregarding information that contradicts the belief. Then placebo, that is getting better just by expecting to get better. Self-efficacy, which means it's like an active placebo, that you're convinced that you're able to do something, and just by that you are more likely to actually succeed. Then self-fulfilling prophecies. For example, if you think your coworker doesn't like you, then you behave more restricted to him, and then he actually starts to not like you because you are not likable, and then you fulfill the prediction or the prophecy. Then cognitive dissonance. It's also big in psychology, that if you have contradictions, like two beliefs that don't match together, or if you do something unethical which doesn't conform to your belief about yourself, being a good man, for example, and then you either justify the unethical behavior, or in the other example, you just drop one belief, for example, to make it work in a way. Then the need for cognitive closure. So the feeling of stress or pressure if we feel that things aren't clear or ambiguous, or if there are tasks pending and we really want to get it done or out of our head. Intolerance of uncertainty, just the feeling that we don't like if something's uncertain, what will happen, especially if we are dreading something, if it's unclear what's going to happen. Priming, like which means that, like, if there are cues that make it more likely to think of or feel or behave in ways that are similar to those cues. Or misattribution of arousal. I actually think, for example, when my girlfriend and I are ordering pizza, and right before eating pizza, she really often says, "I love you so much." And this would be, I think, an instance of misattribution of arousal, because she's just really wants to eat the pizza now, and then she says something like, "I love you so much." So I think the classical example is blind dates where they drink coffee as opposed to not drinking coffee, and then when they drink coffee, they like the other more. And there the misattribution of arousal is being aroused through the coffee and thinking, I must like that woman or man. Analogies in general, where one model is similar to another model. The pleasure in music, where music is very predictable, and if you want to minimize predictions, then and it feels good, then this makes sense too. Being disappointed by too high expectations. For example, if someone says this movie is great, it's awesome, and then I think it's going to be great, and then it's okay, and then I'm disappointed. Or if I'm reading in the car, reading a book, and getting sick or feeling sick because my brain isn't predicting the sensory or getting the sensory input where the car is turning. Getting better at sports, and you said something similar. When playing table tennis, for example, I learn how to predict how the ball is moving or flying, and the coordination of hand and the ball. That was a lot. I maybe you can comment on some of them. I think really by going through all of them, it really feels like everything can be explained by the free energy principle. And I thought of this quote of Theodosius Dobzhansky, who said, "Nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution." And it really makes sense to say the same about the free energy principle, at least just by going through all kinds of things like in my everyday life. So maybe you can comment on how I'm wrong, or maybe how I'm right about those.
Right.
And there are many, so you don't have to comment on all of them, just like in a general way.
Absolutely. I'll try and identify the sort of the cross-cutting theme that unite at least most of those. But I just wanted to come back to your nothing makes sense, without other than through the lens of evolution. I think that's very prescient in terms of applying the free energy principle. The free energy principle in and of itself explains everything and nothing, in exactly the same deflationary way that the principle of there is no principle of natural selection, but the principles of natural selection or evolution explain everything and explain nothing, in the sense that natural selection doesn't explain why I've got two eyes, or why I'm walking on legs. It doesn't explain the emergence of cultures and language and the like. You have to do a lot of heavy lifting to get into the particular evolutionary process, to understand the mechanisms and the processes that give rise to the phenomenology and the behaviors and the structures that you want to study and understand and possibly intervene on if you're a therapist. Exactly the same thing goes for the free energy principle. The free energy principle is just there as a first principle account of everything, but explains nothing at the level of the process theory. To have a mechanistic explanation, you have to commit to a particular process theory. What that generally means is a particular generative model and inversion scheme, or sort of message passing scheme, that would do your belief updating. And then we get back to how you would use that in your empirical research, how we'd use that as proof of principle. In the Feynman, being able to build one to understand how it works. But in order to build one to actually make it work, you've got to commit to a particular form for a generative model in a particular paradigm. And I repeat, a particular message passing scheme, predictive coding, belief propagation, variational message passing. You take your pick. All of these are equally viable hypotheses in different parts of the brain, or in different species, or in different kinds of sentient artifacts. So I think that analogy with natural selection is probably as much as needs to be said here. Like natural selection, if you can find some truism or some hypothesis or construct in psychology that has endured for more than 10 years and therefore is likely to be right, if the free energy principle can't explain it, then that means the free energy principle is wrong. So the whole point of the free energy principle is to provide a formal framework within which you can start to model these things and formally explore different process theories, in exactly the same way that if you can find a piece of evidence that would render natural selection impossible, that would be remarkable. You just see one example that can't be explained by natural selection, and the whole theory just disappears. That's the same for the free energy principle, which means everything you mentioned and everything else you could mention should, in principle, be explainable by the free energy principle. But you're going to have to do the explaining. So in just one little twist here, which I quite like. It's very arrogant, really, but I think it's beautiful. The free energy principle and natural selection share another property. Apart from being almost tautological to the point of being vacuous, they also are the only two principles I know of that conform to themselves. So the theories of evolution have themselves evolved through the neo-Darwinian synthesis right through to some current ideas in terms of evolutionary psychology. And the free energy principle also applies to itself, because its whole point is to provide the simplest explanation possible that affords an accurate account of some empirical data. So written into the free energy objective function is this mixture of accuracy and complexity. So you've got to minimize the complexity to have this one simple principle, first principle account. So they both share many structural features, usually articulated in terms of Bayesian model selection, where you do natural selection on your generative models to make them simpler and simpler and simpler, but not too simple, in the words of Einstein. So I think the parallel with natural selection is perfect. Just listening to the examples you brought to the table, all of which it would be really nice if you or somebody wrote a Tix article just unpacking that particular construct and the history, which is usually quite a scholarly and deep history of these ideas, say cognitive dissonance, for example, unpacking that in the formal mechanics of belief updating as furnished by the free energy principle, or one of its variants, active inference, predictive coding, belief propagation. That job has yet to be done, and I'm sure, and somebody will do it in the short term. Within the next, I can guarantee, within 2 or 3 years, all of those things will have a free energy account of, or an active inference account of, by some bright young thing, usually who says, "Well, why hasn't anybody done this?" Well, it's just that there are so many things you could do. No one has, no one person, I think, could possibly do all of these things. Some of them have been done. I worked with some cognitive scientists and psychologists on cognitive dissonance and wishful thinking. So there's a Tix article on a free energy formulation of that. Music, I've worked with some of the leading lights in sort of the cognitive science of music perception. To address the curious appeal of music, which is not quite that it's like really predictable. It's almost the reason we choose to continue listening to music is really the epistemic affordance it has, in that we know, very much like listening to a story or listening to a joke, that the music will set up particular tensions in terms of uncertainty about what's going to happen, but it will be resolved if you keep on listening. So music is absolutely fascinating, as a sort of vehicle to understand the allure of resolvable uncertainty. So the things that underwrite novelty seeking and sensation seeking, just mathematically, they come under the rubric of minimizing expected surprise given I act in this way. Mathematically expected surprise is uncertainty. Uncertainty then underwrites everything. So when it comes to active inference, minimizing the free energy I expect following one of these counterfactual outcomes, I will choose the action that leads to the one with the minimum expected free energy. And that can be written in terms of information gain or epistemic affordance on the one hand, and another kind of surprise relating to my prior preferences and the kinds of outcomes that I think is a characteristic of me, which can usually be read in terms of expected utility theory or reward in reinforcement learning. But that epistemic part is really interesting, that uncertainty resolving, maximizing information gain. If you're a statistician, you'd know it as sort of the principles of optimum Bayesian design, where everything we do can be thought of as an experiment, in the sense of Richard Gregory, that perception is just hypothesis testing. But of course, that begs the question, who designed the experiment in terms of where I look next or what I touch next? There are, so the free energy principle also supplies the imperatives and the principles that label the best moves in terms of those moves that elicit the data that resolves the most uncertainty or is the most informative. So your focus, on uncertainty, I think, is completely licensed by the sort of the formalism and the fundaments of minimizing expected surprise or uncertainty under the free energy principle. And nearly all of your examples, I think, could be cast in terms of minimizing a particular kind of uncertainty. The one you started with, I thought was very interesting, that sort of the confirmation bias, because in order to be Bayes optimal in my world, you have to have an optimism bias. It's exactly the same bias that Richard Feynman was compelled to comply with by walking around the back of the seats. It's also exactly the same kind of bias that I was talking about when talking about moving my hand from here to over here, realizing a prior belief. So before I was saying that you could, if you like, carve up or decompose the free energy that you expect given a particular action into an epistemic part and a more pragmatic part. That pragmatic part rests upon your prior beliefs that we've been talking about that define the kind of thing you think you are. Mm. So if you were a thermostat, it would be the set point, the temperature registered by your thermoreceptor that has been supplied because you've been set at that set point. That represents a prior belief that this is the way the world should be. And the thermostat just acts upon the world to make sure that that particular sensation is in the range that a priori it believed it should be. We are exactly the same. So, whether it's turning your colleague against you because of perceived malign intent, or whether it's pursuing a happy relationship with your girlfriend because you're the kind of person that can commit to a good relationship. If you believe that and you are acting in a way to realize your prior beliefs simply because you want or you have to, in order to exist, choose those actions that minimize the surprise that would be incurred by violating those prior preferences, violating those prior beliefs. So those prior beliefs underwrite the kind of surprise that complements this epistemic reduction of uncertainty that music might embody. That they really underwrite our choice behavior, and of course, in so doing, the outcomes that we actually finally encounter that will always be characteristic of the kind of things that we are, and also the kind of people we are. So if we believe that we are this kind of person in that context or this context, then we will behave like that. We will solicit evidence actively in conversation or in our foraging that this is the kind of person we are. I am a mild-mannered theoretician. You are an earnest interviewer. You have certain prior beliefs about the way you should behave, and of course those prior beliefs are realized. So this confirmation bias, I would say, is the existential imperative under a sort of Bayesian brain hypothesis, or under the free energy principle. And I think that theme you can chase through to all of those examples that you bring to the table in terms of resolving uncertainty, in terms of cognitive dissonance, ignoring evidence to the contrary, or not opening that doctor from the letter that says whether or not you've got cancer. If a priori you believe you're the kind of creature that doesn't get cancer and dies, which we have to in order to live, then you're certainly going to, in a Bayes-Optimal way, ignore evidence to the contrary. So if we're all self-evidencing, evidence for what? For the kind of thing that I think I am.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, for one, that and I've heard this before, that free energy principle is in several ways similar to natural selection. And I mean, the theory of natural selection is big and is being applied in all kinds of settings, and would be great to see the free energy principle is already being applied in very different domains and fields, which is great. And yeah, I think also once those people in the next years will reinterpret or redescribe the phenomena with a process theory like active inference, then they'll be able to tweak the parameters and yeah, just like you said, with the mechanistic account, which makes it so much more useful to study those things. And I'm excited how this will turn out. You said already in this interview, this time I'm sure, that all types of psychopathology are false inference in a way. I have this German book of Judith Beck. She's the daughter of Aaron Beck, who is the father of cognitive therapy and then cognitive behavioral therapy. And I translated a little part, which I think, just sounds similar to your argument that basically all is false inference, but then again, maybe I'm too interpreting it too psychologically. So she says something like, the cognitive model says that dysfunctional thoughts that influence feelings and behavior are central to all mental disorders. If patients learn to question their thoughts in a more realistic and useful manner, they will experience improvements in their emotions and behaviors. Yeah, would you say this relates to false inference, or how is it again too psychologically?
Oh no. I think that has a truth to it, which is central to where you'd end up with if you wanted to use the mechanistic belief updating calculus that the free energy principle brings to the table as a therapist. Yeah, so very often, certainly in talking therapies and also cognitive behavior therapy, that becomes a little bit more inactive in that you're encouraged to sort of record what you've done and actively solicit evidence for these hypotheses that may be completely implausible but remain untested in some subjects, that keep them locked into certain styles of behavior simply because they don't actively challenge or solicit the evidence for these hypotheses. So that what I see in conversation with therapists, psychotherapists, and other kinds of therapists is this common thread that the kind of false inference that you see in a therapeutic, and I'm talking about a CBT or a psychotherapeutic setting. So I'm not talking about Parkinson's disease or heavy neglect or people actively psychotic and with delusional systems. Those are all sort of nice examples of false inference, but at different scales. I'm talking about a false inference about narratives about how I engage with my lived world. So patterns of behavior, attitudes, positional stances, and determine how I treat going outside, or how I treat this tendency for repetitive behavior in obsessional compulsive disorder, for example, or how I might understand my tendency to fall into a pattern of behavior that would you'd find in eating disorders, in terms of sort of false inference, dysmorphophobias, false inference about my body, and what so those kinds of false inference talk to a very particular kind of hypothesis that has been misattributed too much precision, and those are hypotheses about the kind of thing I am and what I am going to do in this situation. So bear in mind that belief updating in a brain can be about a myriad of things. It could just simply be at the level of sensory perception, the orientation of an edge in my visual field. But at some point, deep in that hierarchy, will be the key representations that are the raison d'etre for this kind of active inference, which is basically, what am I going to do next? Whether that's am I going to deploy my saccadic eye movements next, or where am I going to spend my summer holidays, or am I going to take my lateral flow device test or not? So plans that have to be resolved by choosing those that minimize the expected uncertainty and surprise in relation to prior preferences. The very fact that you have to have these hypotheses about what I'm going to do presents a problem now. How many do you consider, and what precision do you apply to your beliefs about the different policies and the different ways of engaging the world? And you can see immediately that if you get that wrong, that can be quite a pernicious failure. So, for example, if I've got my favorite policy, which may be the kind of policy that underwrites obsessional compulsive behavior or addictive behavior, and I always commit to this because I've assigned it too much weight in relation to competing policies, then I will engage in a vicious cycle of securing evidence for the fact, for my belief, I am somebody with OCD. I am somebody in chronic pain. I am somebody who is addicted. And because if I now play out the kinds of behaviors that will maintain that that hypothesis. That I will be supplying evidence for that will basically to use your example previously, that will endorse that confirmation bias. So what's the job of the therapist in this instance? I think it's just to broaden the portfolio of hypotheses and enable the patient or the client to revisit a particular hypothesis, either by attenuating the precision afforded hypotheses about what to do, or by getting them to explore alternative hypotheses, literally like a scientist might do. So, a bad scientist is one that will just commit a priori to his favorite hypothesis without exploring the null or alternative hypotheses. So the job of the therapist, if you like, or certainly the job of the therapist in terms of setting up a safe space in which to start exploring other hypotheses about ways of being, or ways of getting information, getting evidence about the kind of person or thing that I am. The job would be to, I think, increase the latitude of different hypotheses. And in that sense, the kind of false inference that we're talking about here is one where, for some reason, the patient has become myopic in their particular beliefs about themselves and the policies that they pursue, usually in a way that precludes soliciting evidence for other ways of being, another without help, other ways of engaging with the world. Does that make sense?
Yes, makes sense. And yeah, a couple of things I want to say here. So in cognitive behavior, they also have the notion of, or the technique of behavioral experiment, if I translate it just like that, that you in fact go out in the world and seek evidence for beliefs that you have. They also make them with worksheets assign probabilities to their beliefs, which really sounds like precision on prior beliefs. And then there's the technique of cognitive reappraisal, where you see things from a different angle or in a new light, which creates some new or bigger space of beliefs. And yeah, it all sounds, is it here or at your place? This noise?
I think it must be your place.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I will cut this out. Yeah.
Well, your girlfriend probably wants some more pizza, so
I think it's the pizza, yeah. Yeah, so it really sounds, again, appealing, and yeah, it all somehow ties back to the free energy principle, but as you said, it has to be that way. What about, so the C from the CBT is a lot with those questioning beliefs, seeing things in a different light. And then the behavioral part is often with things like reward and exposition. So you, well, again, in exposition, you go, for example, if you're afraid of something, you go in this scene and you collect the sensory data to see, oh, either the body's experiencing no fear and is calming down, or subjectively conscious believes, oh, nothing's going to happen here, which makes sense too. But what about the, and I don't know if you've heard of them, the third wave therapies, like acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness-based therapy, where you have not the cognitive or maybe epistemic part and not the reward part, but then going more into the emotions. And for example, acceptance and commitment therapy, accepting emotions, accepting difficult thoughts or sensations. How could you explain that? Is it, for example, if you are really not liking the anxiety, so it's again on a meta level, so I'm feeling anxious and I don't want to feel anxious, but instead of don't wanting to feel anxious, you start to accept feeling anxious, saying, okay, it's just a feeling, and it goes away, or even appreciate it for some, I don't know, evolutionary good things that come with it. How would you explain this in your framework?
That's a great question. I'm not familiar with that kind of acceptance, third wave um, approach, but it does sound very interesting. I'm more familiar with sort of mindfulness and, and chemically speaking, that may not be so distant from things like psilocybin-assisted talking therapies or CBT as well, in the sense that both mindfulness and psychedelic treatments both have the effect of attenuating the precision of greater hierarchical depth. So psilocybin-like drugs would act on 5-HT2A receptors that are located fairly deep in the hierarchy, and mindfulness would just use endogenous mechanisms to increase sensory precision relative to prior beliefs. I think both of them can be easily thought of in terms of reducing the precision of prior commitments and prior beliefs. So sometimes articulated in terms of flattening the precision landscape or the landscape of differences between a commitment to one belief versus other belief at the higher level that is mediated by relatively increasing sensory precision, by attending to the sensorium or attending to your breathing, for example. So by de-emphasizing and reducing the relative precision of these deeply held convictions, I think there's an easy mechanistic story to be told that would reverse the pathological commitment to something that's got you caught in a rut, that this very precise, this is the kind of thing that I'm going to do, but just reducing the precision generically about prior beliefs throughout the hierarchy would in a way reveal or bring into focus alternative hypotheses that were a priori or previously so implausible, but now because you've reduced your prior precision over all the alternative accounts, they now become potentially entertainable. So that would be one generic mechanism to increase the scope of alternative hypotheses. And as soon as you've got one, then that now has epistemic affordances. As soon as you think, oh, it could be like that, then that becomes attractive because it's got the potential to support this reduction of uncertainty. Well, perhaps if that's the way that the world is, or I am, then if I did that, I can see myself now actually doing this and, for example, subjecting myself to exposure or flooding therapy. As long as I've got the hypothesis that perhaps I won't have a catastrophe, I won't have a heart attack, or the spider's not actually going to bite me. As soon as you can entertain that hypothesis, then exposing yourself to this potential situation becomes epistemically quite attractive. But all that depends upon dissolving the overly precise prior beliefs that you've been using for the past few years or since a particular trigger point in your life. The acceptance thing, that's very interesting. I've never heard of that before. I would imagine it's got something to do with what we were talking about before, where you have the notion, a hypothesis, I am suffering. So, which is not the same as being anxious. So I've got at one level of my model, I am in a state of anxiety. And at the next level, I am suffering from being in a state of anxiety. And if those beliefs can be revised, then you will stop the suffering. So I've heard very similar arguments in terms of chronic pain, on a much simpler level. If you can get people who are suffering from chronic pain to accept it in a way that enables them to reinterpret or explore alternative hypotheses for these odd sensations. So I think the classic example, you've got a tummy ache. And this ache could either be interpreted as I've eaten too much, or this is a resurgence of my chronic abdominal pain. Two equally plausible hypotheses, but the person with chronic pain will ignore the I've just eaten too much and will use the exercise. And of course, that supplies those interoceptive sensations now provide confirmatory evidence. Oh, I am a sufferer of chronic pain, and I am suffering, as opposed to this is just I've eaten too much and it will go away. So And of course, if you want to secure evidence for your hypothesis, I am suffering from chronic pain, you are going to attend to all these interoceptive signals and discover more. So it's against its confirmation bias, but in the context of a potentially aberrant kind of false inference about states of being. The tummy ache one is, I think, an interesting example, because what we all tend to do is to replace those sensations by rubbing our tummy when it hurts. So this is a nice example of using sensory attenuation that we can generate through action to override the failure or to ignore these particular sensations that are providing evidence for I'm in pain. So I imagine that sort of the acceptance idea would be basically exploring other hypotheses that are best explained by a state of non-suffering, if that makes sense. So if I was trying to simulate this in a computer, I would have representations, I am suffering versus I am not suffering. And I'd be looking for evidence, different hypotheses that were apt explanations for being in this state versus that state. And of course, being in pain would be evidence that I am suffering. But having an alternative explanation for being in pain, such as this is a consequence of eating too much, would then remove the evidence for I am suffering, and therefore there would be more evidence for I am not suffering. So just by readjusting the again the hypothesis space, perhaps it is just the feeling anxiety, for example. I mean, that's entirely functional. If we didn't feel angst or anxiety, we'd be in a very, very difficult position in terms of deploying our attention and sensory attenuation. So anxiety is not suffering. But if somebody's got this notion, this hypothesis that to be anxious is to suffer, that alternative explanations might be entertained if you can install those alternative hypotheses in a therapeutic setting, so that they can experience anxiety in an entirely functional, normal way without that supplying evidence for their notion that they are suffering. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes,
I have to read
yes.
that.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, really interesting. So I have to re-watch this episode again, because there's so much coming into my head, but I'm also looking at the time. But I don't want to go just yet with the acceptance thing. So you accept the if you accept the anxiety, then your new hypothesis is you're not suffering, so to speak, from the anxiety, but the anxiety is more like a feeling, like you said with this tummy ache or something. It's just feelings in my body, and then and it's also in the acceptance literature. Paradoxically, this will make the anxiety go away, not because you do something, but just by taking another perspective on the anxiety, but not really wanting to make it go down, because that sometimes, like, suppression of feelings is just the opposite of what acceptance tries to do. But again, paradoxically, it goes down, and then the patient likes it. So it's a small boundary, I think.
It'd be nice to simulate that. I mean, it certainly makes sense from the point of view of belief updating. So, you've got this circular causality. So everything's trying to be internally consistent in terms of these hierarchical structures. So, if there is anxiety and it's read as evidence for suffering, and then you have committed to an explanation, I am suffering, that will also increase the prior that I am anxious. So if you can destroy that, there is always this sort of this circular interdependency. So that makes entire sense from the mechanics of belief updating. But if you could simulate that would be, that almost paradoxical, counterintuitive. Just by that would be very, very interesting.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so now if you don't mind, I would have a couple more personal questions to end this episode, if that's okay. Yeah, just for example, I've heard you say that you have this, I don't know if it's daily or just on the weekends, routine of in the morning sitting down, I think even smoking a cigar or something, and then and then just thinking. And you said somewhere like without pen or paper. How does it look like? Are you actually sitting there thinking about the free energy principle, and if so, how is it, like more with visual images in your head, or is it like in equations or something? And if you have like an insight, for example, how are you making sure that if you don't have a pen and a paper, that this insight isn't going away?
Yes, it is true that I spend at least an hour, if not 2 hours every morning, and I smoke a pipe. It's not a cigar. It's a pipe. As all great thinkers do. I don't think
Yes,
Sherlock
yes.
Holmes largely. So yeah, I just sit there and smoke and think and just rehearse. So the reason that you don't forget the good stuff, the insights, is that the only good insights are those that are the simple insights. Remember before that the best explanations for anything are those that maximize model evidence, minimize free energy, which just means the simplest account that maintains an accuracy, so that you just keep on rehearsing it until all the complexities disappear. If it's the right explanation, you're not going to forget it because it's so simple. But you do have to keep on rehearsing them. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Also, that I personally think in terms of images and spatially, because a lot of this is about sort of mappings and measurement in metric spaces that are constructed. So, whether that's an emotional space or whether it's a physical or Euclidean space or a more abstract kind of space. The key thing is it's always about spaces, even when I'm imagining the maths. So you're right. I also think about equations in the most aesthetic way of simplifying the equations, but I do it visually, literally by moving around the denominators and the numerators and trying out different sort of operators and substitutions that simplify the equations. But it's all done visually. And then when I get bored with the pipe, and it's time to go into your emails, you try, if you can, write it down before you forget it.
Okay. That makes sense. So, and have you always been like that? I was wondering how you were like a kid. Were you always, and I've heard the story that you have been fascinated with woodlice and how they behave, and it was the first great insight you had. Have you always been like that, like the scientific mind who has those insights and likes to think about those deep questions about the universe and nature and human nature? Or is it more like after graduation of high school, for example, you went to a university and then it became clear that the science basically and then also the free energy principle is what you are so passionate about? Or has it always been like that?
I think it's always been like that. And certainly for me, it has always been like that. So every career choice has just been to either indulge that natural curiosity that comes from the epistemic affordance that we all respond to, in order to get myself into an academic position where you could spend 2 hours every morning smoking a pipe and thinking about theories of everything. But you have to spend a long time before you can do that. But not every job allows you to do that. So you have to be of a certain age. That's what I've always wanted to do. Two things to say. I mean, first of all, if it's the case that we always solicit evidence for the kind of thing we are, then you have to ask, well, why did I think I was a curious little scientist at age 5 or possibly a bit later? I think that has to come from the culture and your parents as well as genetics. So my parents were very much, my mother very interested in psychology. She loved that. She was a nurse, but she was absolutely fascinated by psychology. And my father was an engineer, hence all the emphasis on maths and metrics, which he had to get right for his. So, I imagined being a hybrid product of these two parents. I had to be the kind of person in the metrics of the mind, which is what I ended up doing. The final thing to say, though, of course, is what I've just said about myself applies to everybody, including you. I'm absolutely sure. We are born scientists. We are curious creatures just because we are here. So if it's the case that we are compelled existentially to resolve uncertainty, our whole existence just depends upon being curious creatures, and we express it in different ways. But I think the underlying pressure, do I enjoy it? I can't imagine any other way of being. And I go further than that. It is an existential imperative to be curious and to sate that curiosity.
Yeah, nice. I always ask two questions. So these are the last two questions. So the first one is, what are your 3 favorite hobbies?
Well, smoking, and I used to. I don't have time now, but I used to do a lot of visual art, so that also speaks to thinking graphically. So oil paintings. I wonder if you can see anything here. You can, but it would be indulgent of me to be out paintings. I do have paintings around me.
Yeah.
So painting. That's and the only other hobby I have to confess I indulge in is watching too much television late in the evening. So that's basically soaps and films, basically.
So in the end, you are also like a normal person who just likes to watch television too. That's nice.
In the end, I am the epitome of a normal person. At the end of the day, that's exactly what I am. Yeah.
Okay, and the last question is, if you could travel back in time and go to your younger self who just graduated high school, what career and/or life advice would you give to him?
It was the advice I give to everybody who asks, and people do very much ask, and it's basically to keep your options open. And I could motivate that in terms of the free energy principle, which actually tracks back to James's maximum entropy principle. But the idea is part of this being curious and part of trying to find the simplest explanations for your lived world is to keep your options open, to have the greatest latitude that you can in the way that you explain things. Technically, that's maximizing the entropy of your Bayesian beliefs about the way the world works. To do that, though, you really want to leverage, if you can, all the different kinds of mechanics and calculus and ideologies and theologies that you can expose yourself to in as many different languages as you can, from mathematics through to Latin. So obviously not everyone has this opportunity, but if you do, you choose the thing that keeps your options open at every point, and then you should be fine.
Great answer. Inspirational. Okay. Thank you so much for taking your time. I hope you had some fun too. And yeah, so again, thank you so much. And I hope to see all this mechanical active inference work on the psychology and the psychotherapy side to get it more rigorous. And yeah, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Karl Friston, and don't feel ashamed if you haven't understood all of it or most of it. It's normal. And you can find many more materials, talks, podcasts where he's talking about his whole ideas, and also colleagues who talk about these ideas. And they're all for free. So if you want to go deeper into this material, you definitely can. And also the research articles, for example, if you go on Google Scholar, you can find almost all of them for free. So that's great. Yeah, so I hope you can give this video a like and also subscribe this channel, because then I'll be encouraged to ask many more leading scientists to come to the podcast, and they will be encouraged as well, because obviously they want to have a audience as broad as possible. Yeah, so please subscribe this channel. And since it's my first episode, let me say something about how this is all going on in the future. I named the podcast Painting Onions, obviously, because the onion reflects to the idea that this podcast wants to be about multi-level perspectives. So the onion has if you cut an onion in half, you see multiple levels. And in science, there's this idea of multiple levels of analysis. So if you take this leading question of this podcast, how humans work, you can zoom in and look at the biology side, the neurobiology side. You can ask mathematical questions about how humans work. You can ask philosophical questions. You can go up the levels to more cognitive science and psychology, those conscious beliefs and behaviors and feelings that I was also talking about today. And of course, you can go even further, literally spatially further, to include social interactions, and then even society, culture, and so on. So that's the idea behind the onion. And painting onions just means there are these different fields coming to this podcast, and I will try to categorize them in different disciplines, and all these disciplines will have different colors. For example, today is red. Neuroscience is red. So I always will be wearing a red sweater or t-shirt. And yeah, obviously you can't always neatly categorize scientists or the topics they will be talking about in categories, but I think it's a fun way to at least differentiate a little bit among those disciplines. Yes. So in this year, 2022, I will be making 12 episodes. Each will be published on the last Saturday of the month. So 12 episodes, and then next year, we'll see if I make some more or if it stays at this rate of one per month. So, okay, enough said. And I hope you leave the subscription, and I will see you soon in the next one in the end of February.